He wasn't supposed to be home that day. The millionaire had boarded his flight hours earlier, his calendar full, his meetings set, his presence expected across the ocean. But storms changed plans, grounded flights, and pushed him back to the very doorstep no one anticipated him crossing. And when he walked into his own home, silent, polished, everything in its perfect place, he wasn't prepared for what he was about to see. The kitchen, usually quiet at that hour, was alive with something unexpected. Music pulsed faintly from a small speaker, not loud but steady, enough to set a rhythm in the air. His twins, just 7 years old, moved awkwardly in the center of the room, their little hands lifted, their bodies swaying. At first, he thought they were playing some sort of game, but then his eyes narrowed. They weren't just dancing, they were signing. Standing before them, guiding their every movement, was the maid. A black woman in her 30s, focused, her hands fluid, her face lit with patience and determination. Each gesture she made, the children followed, mimicking her fingers, their eyes shining with a mix of joy and concentration. Their laughter was soundless, but their smiles were wide. They weren't dancing to music. They were learning to speak without words. The father froze in the doorway. A millionaire who could buy them anything, build them anything, surround them with the finest schools and the most expensive tutors. Yet here they were, in his own kitchen, learning something he had never thought to give them. Something that cost nothing but time, heart, and empathy. And then it hit him. His children had been hiding a silence he had ignored. He had accepted their difference without question, assuming money and comfort would be enough. But watching them now with this woman society often overlooked, he realized he had been blind to what they truly needed. Why was this lesson being taught not by him, not by professionals he hired, but by the maid he barely noticed each day? And more importantly, why did it feel like she had given his children something he never could? This was not just a lesson. This was a revelation, and it would change everything. For most people, life was predictable. They woke up, rushed to work, worried about bills, and hoped their children had enough. But for Thomas Whitaker, predictability was a luxury he could afford to bend. A self-made millionaire in his early 40s, Thomas owned multiple properties, traveled often, and lived in a world where schedules were dictated not by necessity, but by choice. His days were lined with assistants, chauffeurs, and meetings in glass towers. His nights were often spent in penthouse suites overlooking foreign skylines. Back at home, however, life carried on without him. His mansion, tucked into the quiet edge of an affluent suburb, was a fortress of marble floors and polished steel appliances. It was a place where silence echoed, broken only by the movements of the staff who kept it pristine. For Thomas's 7-year-old twins, Emily and Ethan, this silence was more than just the absence of noise. It was the reality of their lives. Both had been born with hearing impairments. Doctors had explained it clinically, friends had whispered it quietly, and Thomas had accepted it with the same detached efficiency he gave to financial reports. He made sure they had everything, private therapists, the latest technology, expensive tutors. He ensured they lived surrounded by comfort. But beneath the polished surface of provision, something vital was missing: connection. Their world was shaped not only by silence, but also by a father too busy, too preoccupied to sit with them in it. That gap was filled unknowingly by someone else. Marcia, the maid, had been with the household for just under a year. She was in her early 30s, a black woman who had worked in homes like Thomas's before, though never one quite so opulent. To most employers, she was invisible, a uniform that cleaned, polished, and disappeared into the background. But to Emily and Ethan, she was something different. She noticed them. She smiled when they entered a room. She bent down to their level when they wanted to show her something. And more than anything, she treated them not as fragile children, but as little humans capable of learning, expressing, and being heard, even without sound. What Thomas did not know, because he never asked, was that Marcia had once studied sign language. Her younger cousin back in her hometown had been born deaf, and it was Marcia who learned to communicate with him when others grew impatient. To her, sign language wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge. And in the Whitaker household, she began to use it quietly at first with the twins. A simple good morning, a small gesture for happy, or a sign for thank you. The children picked it up instantly, their eyes wide with recognition that someone was speaking to them in their own language. The days unfolded, and what began as quiet exchanges during chores became something deeper. In the afternoons after homework, she would show them new signs, linking them with rhythm, turning learning into dance. The children laughed in silence, their joy uncontainable as they clapped and moved in sync. Slowly, they began to use these gestures, not just with her, but with each other, creating conversations their father had never seen or heard. All of this happened in corners Thomas never noticed. He assumed the children's progress came from the tutors he hired or the expensive programs he paid for. He never imagined that the most meaningful education was happening right in his own kitchen, taught not by professionals but by the woman he rarely addressed beyond, "Clean this," or "Make sure of that." That day, when Thomas's unexpected arrival brought him home hours earlier than planned, the hidden world inside his mansion unfolded before him. As he pushed open the door and walked across the familiar marble floor, the sound of faint music drifted from the kitchen. Confused, he followed it, each step carrying him closer to something he had never seen. There, framed in the soft afternoon light, were his children, hands moving, faces alive, bodies swaying. And there was Marcia, guiding them with gestures he couldn't comprehend. For the first time, Thomas did not see silence. He saw language. He saw joy. He saw something he hadn't given his children. But instead of warmth, the moment struck him with discomfort. His jaw tightened. His chest grew heavy. Because behind the beauty of what was happening was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Someone else had given his children what he, with all his wealth, had failed to provide. And as he stood frozen in the doorway, one question pressed against him harder than the marble walls around him. What else had he overlooked? Thomas Whitaker remained still in the doorway longer than he expected, his hand tightening around the polished brass handle. He was a man who prided himself on control of his businesses, his time, his reputation. But in that moment, watching Marcia and his children, control seemed to slip through his fingers. Emily's face glowed with joy as she moved her hands fluidly, her lips forming a small laugh without sound. Ethan followed, slower but determined, glancing at his sister and then back to Marcia for guidance. Their movements were synchronized, rhythmic, as if the silence that defined their lives had transformed into something vibrant and alive. Marcia stood between them, not as an employee bound to chores, but as a teacher, a guide, almost like family. She clapped silently, encouraging their gestures, her expression full of warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold formality of the house itself. Thomas's chest tightened. He was proud of his children, yes, but pride was tangled with something else, something darker, jealousy, resentment, fear. He had spent millions ensuring his children had the best of everything. Yet it was this woman, paid to dust furniture and mop floors, who was giving them something priceless. Connection, confidence, a voice in their silent world. The thought unsettled him. He stepped forward suddenly, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The sound shattered the moment. Marcia spun around, startled, her hands lowering quickly as though caught doing something forbidden. Emily and Ethan froze mid-motion, their faces falling, their joy retreating like waves pulled back into the ocean. "Sir?" Marcia began carefully, her voice trembling with the awareness of boundaries she had never dared to cross. But Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. He wasn't angry in the loud shouting sense. His power was quieter, colder, the kind of power that came from a single raised eyebrow, from silence stretched too thin. "What exactly is happening here?" His voice was calm, but beneath it lay accusation. The twins glanced at each other, confused, sensing his disapproval even if they couldn't hear it. Marcia swallowed, steadying herself. "I was just helping them. They've been eager to learn sign language. It gives them—" "That's not your job." The words cut like glass, sharp and final. The air in the kitchen grew heavy. Marcia lowered her gaze, her shoulders stiffening under the weight of his tone. The children fidgeted, their small hands twitching as though unsure whether to continue or retreat. For Thomas, the conflict wasn't just about boundaries. It was about what this moment revealed. If his children could communicate this freely with Marcia, then they had been hiding a world from him. A world where he was absent. A world where he was unnecessary. And in Thomas's mind, that was unacceptable. Still, when he looked at his twins, he couldn't ignore the light in their eyes. A light he hadn't seen in years, not from tutors, not from the specialists he hired, not even from his rare appearances at school events. And that realization clawed at him in a way that success and money had never prepared him for. The days that followed were thick with tension. Thomas carried himself through meetings and business calls, but his mind lingered on the kitchen scene. He noticed small details now, how his children's hands moved when they thought he wasn't looking, how they smiled at Marcia with a trust they had never extended to him. Every gesture between them felt like a secret conversation he was excluded from. And every time he caught it, his chest burned. At night, he paced his study, replaying the image in his mind. The world had taught him to measure worth by wealth, but this woman, this Maid, was proving otherwise. She had given his children something he could not buy, and the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. His reaction shifted from discomfort to suspicion. Was Marcia overstepping her place? Was she undermining his role as a father? Or worse, was she making him look like a failure in his own home? One evening, Thomas called Marcia into his study. The air smelled faintly of cigar smoke, the heavy oak desk between them a deliberate barrier. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice low and measured. "Your duties here are specific: cleaning, cooking, maintaining order, nothing more." Marcia clasped her hands tightly, fighting to maintain composure. "With respect, sir. They need this. They need someone to talk to in their own way. Don't you see how happy they are?" Her words hung in the air, daring, dangerous. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He should have dismissed her immediately, but something in her conviction unsettled him. Instead, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "That will be all." Marcia left, her back straight, her face calm. But inside, she knew the storm wasn't over. She had touched a nerve. She had crossed an invisible line in the household hierarchy, and there would be consequences. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. Emily and Ethan moved with hesitation, sensing the tension without needing to hear it. They looked for Marcia constantly, clinging to her presence, as though instinctively knowing she was at risk of being taken from them. And Thomas, watching from a distance, felt a new conflict rising within him. He wanted to assert control, to remind everyone whose name was on the deed, whose money built the walls they lived in. But a part of him, small, unwelcome, persistent, was haunted by the sight of his children signing joyfully under Marcia's guidance. That image refused to leave him. And deep down, Thomas knew the story was heading toward a moment he could no longer control, a moment that would not only define his relationship with Marcia, but with his own children. The storm broke on a Thursday evening. Thomas had returned from his office later than usual, his thoughts heavy with contracts and acquisitions. The house was quiet, too quiet. He set his briefcase down, his polished shoes echoing through the marble hallway. Then he heard it, a faint rhythm of laughter, not the kind made with sound, but the silent joy of breathy giggles, the type only his children knew how to share. He followed it to the kitchen, and there it was again, Marcia stood before his twins, their small hands moving rapidly, their faces glowing with pride as they signed whole sentences back to her. Tonight was different. Tonight they weren't just mimicking gestures. They were telling stories. Ethan signed about a bird he had seen in the garden, his eyes wide with excitement. Emily added to it, describing the way its wings moved. Marcia nodded, responding in full sentences of her own, bridging their silence into something alive. And Thomas realized with a gut punch, he didn't understand a single thing his children were saying. His own flesh and blood, communicating fluently, joyfully, in a language he had never bothered to learn. He was an outsider in his own home. He stepped forward. The moment shattered. The twins froze, their hands falling awkwardly, guilt flashing across their innocent faces as though they'd been caught stealing. Marcia turned, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "What is this?" His voice was sharper this time, cutting through the air. "Didn't I make myself clear?" Marcia didn't flinch. For the first time since she'd worked in that house, she stood tall, her chin lifted. "Sir, with all due respect, what you saw was your children. Finding their voice." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Their voice! You're here to clean floors, not play teacher." Her eyes burned with quiet defiance. "I clean floors, yes. But when I see children who live in silence, aching for connection, I cannot ignore that. Sir, they need this more than anything money can buy. They need to be heard, even if the world refuses to listen." The words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to snap back, to reassert dominance. But then Emily moved. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward. Her little hands began to sign, not clumsy, not hesitant, but deliberate. She signed Daddy. And then, with eyes brimming with hope, she signed Learn with Us. The room went still. Thomas felt something pierce him deeper than any accusation, deeper than any humiliation. His daughter wasn't asking for more toys, more tutors, more gifts. She was asking for him, for his presence, for his willingness to cross into their world, instead of forcing them to live silently in his. His throat tightened, but pride fought back, clawing at his chest. He looked at Ethan, who had joined his sister, signing with both hands now. "Please, Daddy!" Tears welled in Thomas's eyes, blurring his vision. For years, he had prided himself on providing everything money could buy, believing that was love. Yet here, in his own kitchen, his children revealed a truth that stripped him bare. Money could build a mansion, but it could not build understanding. And Marcia, this maid he had dismissed, belittled, nearly punished, had given them that gift. Thomas turned away, gripping the countertop to steady himself. The marble felt cold beneath his palm, grounding him as waves of realization crashed. His entire identity, as provider, as father, as master of his domain, was unraveling. Finally, he turned back. His eyes met Marcia's, and for the first time, there was no superiority, no command, only humility. He lowered himself onto one knee before his children. His hands trembled as he lifted them, awkwardly trying to mimic the gestures they had made. His movements were clumsy, unsure. But when he signed the word love, both twins broke into radiant smiles that lit the room brighter than any chandelier. Marcia's breath caught, her hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. For Thomas, it was the most vulnerable moment of his life. A man who had conquered boardrooms, dictated empires, and crushed competitors, brought to his knees by 2 children and a woman society tried to overlook. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was alive. It was sacred. And in that silence, a new bond was born, one that money had never been able to buy. The moment in the kitchen lingered in the air like a sacred hymn. For Thomas, kneeling before his children, signing the word love was not just an attempt at communication. It was an act of surrender. A surrender of his pride, his stubbornness, and the walls he had built around his heart. The twins embraced him. their small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. Ethan's silent laughter vibrated against his chest. Emily buried her face into his shoulder, clinging as if she had finally been seen for the first time in her life. Marcia stood nearby, her hands trembling. She hadn't expected this. For weeks she had feared being cast out, punished, or humiliated for defying his orders. Yet here he was, a man of unimaginable wealth and power, undone by the very thing he had tried to reject, love expressed in the language of his children. But the story didn't end in that kitchen. The following days brought a quiet transformation to the household. Thomas, once too consumed by stock markets and mergers to notice the rhythm of his children's lives, now carved out time each morning and evening to sit with them. The lessons were clumsy at first. His hands, trained for contracts and signatures, stumbled through the simplest signs. Sometimes he grew frustrated, his temper flickering like it once had in boardrooms. But each time he looked into the eager eyes of Ethan and Emily, he felt a conviction deeper than any corporate ambition. This was the real work of his life, and Marcia became his unlikely teacher. In the grand dining room, once a stage for wealthy clients and fine wine, she now spread out flashcards and books on American Sign Language. She guided Thomas patiently, her calm presence a counterweight to his impatience. She corrected him gently, never mocking, never scolding. For every mistake he made, she reminded him of the importance of persistence. At first, Thomas bristled at taking instruction from someone he had once dismissed as just a maid, but with each passing lesson, he saw her not as a servant, but as a bridge between himself and his children, between ignorance and understanding, between prejudice and compassion. His transformation did not go unnoticed by the children. Ethan, who once hesitated to sign in front of his father, now flourished, his hands flying confidently as he recounted stories of his day. Emily beamed with pride each time her father understood her without needing translation. Their bond with him deepened, and for the first time in their young lives, they felt that their silence no longer separated them from the man they called Daddy. But transformation rarely comes without resistance. One evening, Thomas hosted a small gathering of his wealthy peers. The men and women, dressed in tailored suits and gowns, sipped champagne and traded casual remarks about markets, art, and politics. At the center of the room, Thomas brought his children forward. With Marcia by their side, they began to sign a simple story, a butterfly in the garden, a song without sound. The guests looked on with a mix of confusion and discomfort. One man chuckled, whispering under his breath, "Teaching them to flap their hands won't change the fact that they can't speak." A woman, draped in diamonds, forced a polite smile and murmured, "It's unusual." Thomas heard it all. Once he might have laughed along, dismissing the whole thing to maintain his standing among his peers, but not anymore. He rose from his chair, his gaze steady, his voice firm. "My children have a voice," he said, gesturing toward Ethan and Emily. "You just don't understand it. But I promise you this. What they are saying carries more meaning than half the words traded in this room." The crowd fell silent. Marcia looked at him, her eyes shimmering with pride. For the first time, Thomas had not only stood for his children, but also for her, for the courage she had shown in giving them what he could not. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, others frowning. But it didn't matter. For Thomas, this was not about their approval. It was about finally doing right by the two souls who mattered most. And yet, the deepest impact was not in the parties or the private lessons. It was in the quiet moments. It was in the way Thomas now lingered at bedtime, his hands moving slowly, deliberately to sign, "Good night. I love you." It was in the mornings when Emily signed, "You tried today. I saw, I'm proud of you." It was in Ethan's drawings, once silent scribbles, now annotated with signed words he wanted his father to learn. The house itself seemed to change. Where once there had been silence heavy with distance, now there was silence alive with meaning. And Marcia? She became more than a maid. She became family. Neighbors noticed her walking with the children, holding their hands, teaching them signs as they explored the garden. Teachers at the children's school spoke of their sudden burst of confidence. Even the house staff, once wary of Thomas's stern demeanor, began to see him soften. He greeted them with a nod, sometimes even a smile. But the most remarkable transformation was within Thomas himself. For a man who once measured worth in dollars and deals, he now measured it in moments. The pride he once took in quarterly earnings was replaced by the pride of signing a full sentence to his children without mistake. The joy of winning contracts paled in comparison to the joy of seeing his twins beam with pride as he joined their world. He had not just learned a language, he had learned humility. He had learned compassion. He had learned that the walls of wealth could isolate, but the bridges of love could heal. And he knew deep down that none of this would have happened without Marcia. One evening, as the sun set and the golden glow filled the kitchen where it had all begun, Thomas turned to her. His voice, softer than it had ever been, carried words he once thought he would never say. "Thank you for giving me back my children." Marcia's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "No, sir. They were never gone. You just needed to learn how to hear them." The truth of those words sank deep into his soul. And so the millionaire, once blind to the world beyond his wealth, discovered the priceless truth. Love does not always come in the language we expect. Sometimes it is silent, sometimes it is seen, sometimes it is carried by the courage of those society overlooks. But always it is stronger than pride, richer than money, and louder than silence. How many children live unheard because the world refuses to learn their language? How many voices are dismissed because they do not sound like ours? Until we choose to listen, not with our ears but with our hearts, we will remain deaf to the truth.